Hello, everyone, and welcome. My name is Kambiz Ranavardi, co-president of ColumbiaDC and graduate of School of Engineering and Applied Science. First, let me thank our longtime partners, Harvard Club of Washington, D.C., and their members for being with us this evening. We are very privileged to have Dr. Sandy Greenberg, chairman of the Board of Governors at Johns Hopkins University's Wilmer Eye Institute, as well as entrepreneur, author, and founder of End Blindness, to discuss his recent book, Hello, Darkness, My Old Friend, How Daring Dreams and Unyielding Friendship Turned One Man's Blindness into Extraordinary Vision for Life. This would be in conversation with Miguel Fernández-Flores, documentary producer at Voice News. Please allow me to very briefly introduce our speakers, but I do encourage everyone to check our website for a fuller list of their accomplishments. Sanford Greenberg is chairman of the Board of Governors at Johns Hopkins University's Wilmer Eye Institute, the largest clinical research research enterprise in ophthalmology in the United States. He is a fellow of the American Academy of Arts and Sciences, as well as a member of the Council on Foreign Relations. He is a trustee emeritus of Johns Hopkins University and Johns Hopkins Medicine, which incorporates the School of Medicine and the hospital. Dr. Greenberg received his bachelor's as Phi Beta Kappa from Columbia University in '62. He earned his master's and PhD from Harvard University and his MBA from Columbia. He was a Marshall Scholar at Oxford University and attended Harvard Law School. He lives in Washington, D.C. with his wife, Sue, and they have 3 children and 4 grandchildren. And our host, no other than Miguel Fernández-Flores, Mexican documentary producer and shooter at the long-form unit of Voice News in New York. He is the author of the HBO short documentary, Beating Blindness. So without further ado, it's all yours.
Thanks, Kavis. Thanks, everyone at Columbia Alumni Association of Washington, D.C. and the Harvard Club of Washington, D.C. for being here. We are in the presence of an extraordinary human being. I am honored today to be able to interview Sandy Greenberg about his marvelous book, Hello, Darkness, My Old Friend, which I invite everyone here to read. In his book, Sandy talks about his life and the incredible journey he had to endure to overcome the most difficult obstacles and to ultimately conquer them, achieving so much in his life. Mr. Greenberg, Sandy, thanks so much for being here today, sir. It is an honor.
My pleasure.
To the audience, please type your questions in the comments box, in the Q&A box, and we'll read them at the end of my conversation with Sandy. First of all, Sandy, thank you so much. What a great book. I wanted to start to talk to you about your first years, which by your account were very difficult. You were born in Buffalo, New York, the first of 3 children to Albert and Sarah Greenberg. In a tragic turn of events, your father, Albert Greenberg, passes away suddenly, and Sarah, your mom, is left as the sole purveyor of you and your 3 siblings, your own mother, your grandmother eventually. Your mother, Sarah, is one of the first angels of your life. What an extraordinary person. Can you tell me a little bit about that choice he has to do at the moment of death, at the death of your father?
Well, my father, when he died, left my mother, Sarah, with $54 and 3 children under 5 years old to raise. And at one point early on, she approached a social service agency to see if they could provide some assistance for her and for her 3 children. They said they'd be pleased to do it so long as she separated her 3 children and placed them in 3 separate orphanages. That simply was not going to happen. My mother would not compromise our family for anything. She was a woman not used to laughing very much. So when she did laugh, it was very pleasing to all of us. She was reserved, quiet, thoughtful, deliberate, and like the Israelis say, a sabra. tough on the outside, sweet on the inside.
And so through a lot of work during many years, she has to be the sole provider of your family, and life is very tough. So she eventually marries your Carl Albert's brother, who worked in the scrap metal and junk business. And you, sir, you were very determined from a young age. I'm going to read a transcript from your 1958 yearbook from Bennett High School in Buffalo, New York. This is a considerable list. You were president of the senior class, president of the student council, president of the Buffalo Inter-High School Student Council, representative of the Empire Boys State, Legion of Honor, associate editor of the school yearbook, chief counsel of the senior class, member of the Bennett High School Hall of Fame, member of the Legion of Honor, Key Club, French Honorary Society, cross-country and track team, and finally, sir, prom king. I also understand that earlier you were very good at spelling bee. Can you tell us your most memorable spelling bee moment, sir?
Yes. I fell in love with a young girl in 6th grade. Her name was Sue, but she paid no heed to me. And she actually wouldn't speak to me. And I, in turn, wouldn't speak to her. So what she did was the most natural thing. In 8th grade, it turns out that she and I were the runners up in a spelling contest, which was sponsored by the then Buffalo Evening News. And the word was silhouette that we had to spell. And unfortunately, she misspelled it. And I was left with somewhat of a dilemma. Do I spell it correctly and possibly embarrass her? Or do I spell it right because that was the right thing to do? So I spelled it right. And fortunately, it was the first step in bringing the two of us closer together.
And so with these achievements, you go to Columbia College on a full scholarship in 1958.
Yes, sir.
And in new student orientation, you meet a remarkable person, Arthur Garfunkel. Tell us what made you notice him, not only as a friend, but as an alternative thinker in those early years.
We shook hands during our freshman orientation week. And there was something special about the way he shook his hand and spoke to me. And soon we became good friends. We talked a lot. We took a lot of classes together. One day we were coming out of our humanities class, and he asked me to come over and look at a patch of grass. This was about Amsterdam and 118th Street. And I was puzzled, but he was my friend, so I walked over, and he gave me a little lecture on this measly piece of grass. He told me to look at how light illuminated the beauty and colors of the grass. It was a stunning moment because for some reason, that instant, that serious look at that patch of grass transmogrified my view of nature and indeed my view of life. And that brought us closer together.
And it brought you together to a point where you make a pact, or he...
Yes, he approached me at the end of our freshman year, and even though he had just joined a rival fraternity, and he said, I'm going to give you 5 reasons why you're going to room with me next year. And I didn't say anything because I was concerned about this since he had joined a rival fraternity. He said, he laid out the 5 reasons, which I lay out in the book and won't bore you with. But one of the reasons which you alluded to was that we would create a pact in which if one or the other was an extremist, the other would come to his aid. And I did not know how important that pact would be within the next couple of years of my life.
Yeah. And we'll go back to that, sir, for sure. I want to talk about the first chapter of your book, Stranger on a Train, that I find of great symbolism. Can you describe to us what it describes, that book?
It was a transition point in my life, as I think I make clear in the piece. I had just walked out of an exam at Columbia, which is a terrible thing to do. And I knew that one chapter of my life had just concluded. And sitting alone in that train for an 8-hour ride across New York State gave me plenty of time to think about my circumstance, which was, in a word, abjectly miserable. A doctor sat down across from me and offered me a cookie. And I didn't want to be near him or talk to him or have a conversation at all. And he took out the cookie and he placed it on my lips. And he asked me to take a bite. It was very important to him because if I was his boy, he would want his boy to eat something. So I tasted it, and it was extremely powerful in its effect on me. And then after I had done that, he basically shoved the rest of the cookie in my mouth, and I hadn't eaten for hours. And so I had a sugar rush that was extraordinary. And I asked him if he knew anything about broken eyes, because he was telling me about his job as an orthopedist to fix people's bones, broken bones.
Yes.
And he indicated he didn't really know much about eyes. And that was another way of the first way I began admitting that I was now in a very terrible state.
A doctor had misdiagnosed your glaucoma in 1961, and which resulted in the loss of your vision.
Yes.
Entering deeply troubled waters in this. Go ahead, sir.
No, in 1960.
1960, sorry.
No problem.
Can you tell me in 1960, what are the professional alternatives you were offered as a recently blinded young man?
Well, I went to see an ophthalmologist after I stumbled off the mound in a baseball game because it was cloudy and I was unable to see the batter. And I went to one ophthalmologist who told me I had allergic conjunctivitis. And he gave me a drug called neohydrelsol, which I took, but was completely ineffective. And so I was told that there was another doctor who was the best in Erie County. And so my mother and I went to see him. And he put me on a regimen of topical steroids. And when I first started seeing him, my eyes were still basically 20/20. And by the end of the year, they were 0/0 because topical steroids.
They don't really.
Steroids just brought out the glaucoma.
Yeah.
That must have been within me.
What were your vocational options there, sir? What jobs did they, when you had to go back from Columbia after that train ride, what were the options you were given as for jobs, for example? What things could they proposed that you do as a professional resource?
They proposed in the first instance that I consider making screwdrivers. But if I didn't like that, I could cane chairs. And if I didn't like that, I could perhaps become a justice of the peace.
Right. Can you tell me the role that Art Garfunkel had in helping you navigate these first moments when you're in your parents' home and the future is nothing but uncertain?
Yeah, uncertain is a good word.
Yeah.
Well, when I went home after my surgery, an effort to save my eyes, which unfortunately didn't succeed, I told my girlfriend Sue and my parents and siblings that I really didn't want to see anybody. I was perfectly content to sit alone in the living room and think. The thoughts weren't particularly optimistic. In fact, they were downright pessimistic. And it turns out that despite my request that nobody come and visit me, Arthur decided to do it. And he flew to Buffalo, New York, and he and I took a long walk down the street I lived on. And he began telling me that I had to come back to Columbia. And I told him that there was no conceivable way I could. Don't you see, Arthur? I can't see. I have no resources. How am I going to get through college? And how am I going to survive in Manhattan? He said, well, Sanford, we will work that out. But first, you have to make a decision to come back. And the walk continued for quite some time. And there was some levity during the conversation, but we both knew what was on the agenda. And finally, he turned to me and he said, look, I don't think you get it. What don't I get, Arthur? We made this pact, you see, that if one of us was an extremist, the other would come to his aid. And I'm here to help you. But you have to understand, you have to come back for me. That's what I need.
And so when you actually do return to Columbia,
Yep.
not only you have to do the coursework, but you're a semester behind from everyone else. And that's when Mr. Garfunkel, you say that he divorced himself from the life that he had been living, reading you every day, helping you with the coursework, helping you fill grad school applications, bandaged your shins when they were bloody. All of these lessons of great and incredible generosity. One of these moments also gives the book its title. Can you tell us this anecdote?
Yes. Well, Arthur has a very wonderful and optimistic view of life, and with a very, what I call a crooked sense of humor. So one day he walked in to our room and said, "Sanford, darkness is going to read to you today." Or, "Sanford, darkness is going to read the Iliad." And I suppose that he meant for me, his voice was emerging from the darkness. But the title of the book comes from the fact that he labeled himself darkness. And he is, in fact, my very old friend.
Yeah. In chapter 11, Tough Love, he makes you graduate from the experience there. I think this is one of the most important anecdotes in the whole book. Can you tell us about this one? I'm sorry to ask you to be telling you all these anecdotes, but the book is like that. It is wonderful in the storytelling, so I wanted to insist.
Which anecdote are you referring to?
The subway anecdote.
Oh, the subway, yes. Well, it turned out Arthur had been taking me to see a social worker in Midtown Manhattan, and she was intent on making me understand that I was blind, which didn't particularly sit well with me. And after several meetings, I finally decided to give up. And that day, Arthur and I walked out of her office, and we got down to Broadway. And he stopped me and he said, "Sanford, I forgot to tell you that I have a sketch of the Seagram building due tomorrow morning." He was an architecture student and, in my opinion, a very, very excellent one. And I said, "But Arthur, I've got a reader. I've got Mike Mukasey coming over at 4 o'clock to read to me. I've got to be there." And he said, "But Sanford, all you have to do is come and spend some time with me. And when I'm done making the sketch, I'll take you back." And I said, "Arthur, do you understand, if I don't make this appointment, I will be doomed. My career will be over." That's the intensity that I felt about doing everything I could to combat what was uncompatible. And so we decided to separate. Well, we didn't decide. He just walked away, abandoning me. And so I was left there with a decision to make. And it didn't take me very long to understand that I had to get back to the room. And so I inserted myself into the rush hour crowd and was pushed and shoved down to the cavernous hole of Grand Central Station. And it was a terrible experience. First thing I learned to do was to walk with my arms straight out. And despite the fact that I thought people would consider me either a sleepwalker or a drunkard, I had to do it because it was the only way I could get through the subway. And very soon after I got down there, I walked into a column, an iron column that hit me smack in the face, and my forehead began to bleed. But I couldn't waste time, and so I had to move on. And suddenly, before I knew it, I felt something very soft, and it was a woman's breast. And I started apologizing profusely, I might add. And she said, "Well, that's a first for me." And I said, "Will you please forgive me?" She wiped my forehead and said, "You're a nice boy." And I was thinking to myself that I didn't really know what I was, nice, or whether this new state of affairs for me was dragging me down into a darker world. In any event, she walked away saying, I think it's hard at first, then it gets easier, I think. And she disappeared. I was extremely relieved because that could have been a much more volatile situation. In my joy, however, I ran to get to the shuttle, which was going to take me across town to get the train back to Columbia. And I ran smack into a stroller where the baby started screaming because I had fallen over it. And I was on the ground listening to a mother scream at me in quite angry tones, which I could not understand. And so here I was now, lying over the dirty, greasy, oily tracks. The top half of me was, and I asked God if he would let the train sever me, because I was simply too tired to keep up what I considered the fakery of living my life, because blindness was not to be discussed with anybody. And then I realized that they cared for me as much as I cared for them. So I righted myself and started walking toward the shuttle, bumping into trash cans, briefcases, benches, women, men, children. And finally, I got to the shuttle, which took me across town. And by the time I got on the train to Columbia, my shins and socks were bloody, my forehead still bleeding from the initial hit. But as we were riding uptown, it occurred to me that my grandmother had been born in a little nowhere place in Eastern Europe. And she traveled by herself to London, where she operated a candy store, and then went across a very cruel ocean to the other side of this troubled planet, where she got to Philadelphia and then to Buffalo. And when I realized that my little journey here was nothing in comparison to what she had done, I was relieved. And as the train got closer and closer to Broadway and 116th, I became very relieved. And as I walked up the stairs into the sunlight at Broadway and 16th, I'd crossed to get to the massive iron gates. And I suddenly bumped into a man who said, "Oops, excuse me, sir." And I knew the voice, of course, and it was Arthur. He had followed me the entire way. That moment,
go ahead, sir.
That moment and that episode defined me then and defined me now. And but for that, I wouldn't be sitting here tonight talking with you.
And I appreciate so much this anecdote, sir. Can you tell me if Mrs. Greenberg Sue liked this idea?
I'm sorry, say this.
If I wanted to know if she liked, what did she think about this exercise, this experiment?
Sue has been angry at Arthur for a long time. And she knew that he was toying with my life, but I saw it quite the reverse. He had been my guide through some terrible months, and he concluded that the only way I could become independent was to put me through a test that would really be a test.
Yeah.
But Sue and Arthur and I talk about it from time to time, and now we're able to laugh.
Right. Late Justice Ruth Bader Ginsburg, who was your neighbor and writes a very beautiful foreword to your book, says that you have no dog or use no cane. What's behind that decision? How many scrapes and wounds have you had to suffer because of that, sir?
Well, I don't mean in any respect to demean the use of a cane or a dog.
Of course.
But for me, I felt that it took away from my dignity to be like the rest of humanity, to be able to stand up straight and walk and not be dependent. And also, I wanted my blindness to be a private matter.
Right.
And once you start using the cane, it's no longer private.
Correct. And so she also mentions you talking about the informed life within the mind, a special faculty that people who cannot see possess, by which thoughts are processed undisturbed by the constant flow of visual sense images. Can you please talk to me about this? Because I find this very, very intriguing.
Yes. I live most of my life in my head, as you could expect, as you would expect. I don't have any distractions. When you are walking around during the day, you're seeing what is an analog to a television screen. Your eyes are always drawn to it. I had an experience at the World Economic Forum some years ago. There was a program called Dialogue in the Dark, where many participants were put into a pitch black room. Sue wanted to go. I felt it was more of a busman's holiday, so but I went along with it. And an hour after all these men and women were shaken, they came out and they talked to the reporters. And I was sort of standing on the side, a bit bemused. And a reporter from the German Financial Times asked me what it was like in there. And I said, well, it's not as bad as you think, this blindness business, because when I'm walking down the street, you see garbage cans and all the ugliness that the world has, but I am in the process of creating new enterprises. And that's the truth. My whole life.
Go ahead, sir.
No, my whole life has been spending a lot of time thinking, undisturbed, as Justice Ginsburg said, by any visual sense images. And it's been, for me, one of the saving graces of my life.
Right. Thank you, sir. Despite missing a semester after you went blind, you graduated in 1962
Yes,
with your original class as president and Phi Beta Kappa, which is nothing short of remarkable. But in 1962, sir, you also marry Sue, Mrs. Greenberg. And it's quite beautiful the way you write about her contribution to your life and how in so many ways she renounces her whole life, especially at the beginning, because she loves you so much and believed in you, and she made her life your life. Can you tell us about the contribution, the greatest contribution that she has made for this half a century?
yes. In the first instance, I ought to say simply that I love her. And some people may think that I love her because she stuck with me and was my comfort. That is not true. I simply love her. And that is an affidavit from my heart. Of course, there are cynical people today who would say, what's that worth? And I say, to me, everything. That if the continuous love of a man for a woman is ineffable, which I think it is, then it is as real as the experience of art or music or the love of a child and the many, many untranslatable joys of human life. And so to her, I am indebted, a debt really that can't be paid.
Thank you, sir. You received a master's and a PhD degree in government from Harvard University.
Yes, sir.
Then you attended Harvard Law School. You spent 1 year at Oxford as a Marshall Scholar, and then received an MBA from Columbia Business School.
Yes.
After that, you went to the White House Fellows in President Johnson's administration, where you met Dr. David Rockefeller, who will become your mentor and, I'll just say, another big father figure in your life. I'm sure that many of the people here listening have had the chance to mentor others. Can you talk to us about the power of these mentorships in your life and what they meant to you?
Are you speaking specifically about David Rockefeller?
Yeah, and throughout the book, we can see a lot of people that have been there for you in the same way.
Yes. That's why I contend in the book that I'm the luckiest man in the world. And there's good reason for that. David Rockefeller was one of the three people who founded the White House Fellows program. And he was chairman initially of the Commission on White House Fellows. And I was in the second class of the White House Fellows. For some reason, which to this day I don't understand, he and I knitted a friendship that was truly remarkable. One of the mainstays of my life. He was at the time the richest man in the world. And I can assure you that I was the poorest kid in the world. Nonetheless, we maintained this friendship. And we worked together in business, philanthropy, politics, until virtually his last day. We were together most of the time, luncheons in New York City. But this time, he called and asked me to come to his country home, which I was pleased to do. And when I walked in, he came over to me using his walker and embraced me and asked me if I would kiss him on the cheek. which I did. We then sat down for a couple of hours over lunch. And at the end of it, we both stood up. He came over to me and he hugged me and said, "Will you kiss my other cheek?" That was his way of saying a final goodbye. He died a couple months later.
Thank you, sir. I wanted to, because we're running out of time more or less. I wanted to ask you what happened on May 25th, 1961, if you remember.
May 25th.
President Kennedy announced.
Oh,
Before
yes.
Yeah.
Yeah, a couple months after I lost my eyesight, President Kennedy announced that we were going to the moon and will return man safely to Earth before the end of that decade.
And when was that goal achieved, sir?
July 20th, 1969.
How many days passed before the first date?
2,978.
So in 2012, Mrs. Greenberg and yourself announced the Greenberg Prize, End Blindness 2020, which is a $3 million prize to scientists who contributed the most towards the cause of ending blindness.
Yes, sir.
And 14th of December of 2020, last year, 2,978 days after, the Greenberg Prize was awarded to 13 scientists and researchers. The list where this is big, it's 13 people. It's divided between visionary prize winners and outstanding achievement prize winners. Can you talk to us very generally, because the list is very big and very impressive, about the achievements of a couple of these people, to give us a general picture?
I'd be happy to. First, I think it's important to understand that the process was handled by our National Governing Council and our Scientific Advisory Board. Mm-hmm. Our Scientific Advisory Board, among the finest scientists in the country, including 3 Nobel laureates. And after they made their selections, the Governing Council ratified what they had said, and we wound up selecting 13, because initially it could have been 1 person or 2 or 3, but there was the belief that there were so many people who were making terrific contributions. One woman named Jean Bennett at the University of Pennsylvania pioneered the use of gene therapy. And to be specific, there's a disease called Leber's congenital amaurosis, which is an inherited disease and usually occurs in young children. It's somewhat related to retinitis pigmentosa. And what Jean accomplished first 2 or 3 years ago, the FDA permitted her to use gene therapy in the human body. That was for the first time. And what she and her colleagues did was simply remarkable. There is a gene called RPE65.
Yeah.
And if that is defective, then you're blind. Jean and her team manufactured a healthy RPE65 gene and inserted it into the eye of a blind child. And within a few days, the child could see again.
Yeah.
If you were to ask me, what does end blindness mean? That's what it means.
Yeah, the fact that Luxturna is available, it's been FDA approved and it's available. It's nothing short of remarkable. More than 2 billion people around the world have vision impairments caused by factors including eye disease, structural abnormalities, and aging. with interventions, half of those cases could be treated or prevented. That's why you say in your website. When we were talking about the professional alternatives, you were presented as a young man, the screwdrivers, for example, the chairs. I wonder what this looks like 60 years later, even as the world we live in has changed drastically, such as there's been advance in technology, like compressed speech, for example, and there's been progress in accessibility and inclusivity. Federal laws protect people with disabilities from employment discrimination more than ever. But still, as we were talking the other day, sir, pre-pandemic study assessed that more than half of the US population of people with visual impairments are out of the labor force in the United States.
Yes,
and
sir.
this is pre-pandemic, one of the richest countries on earth. Can you tell us what you think that we can do as a society to tackle this problem? What is the role of society on this?
It's a very good question. I think in the first instance, you see, one of the reasons I believe blind people, 70% of them are unemployed, is because there is a prejudice that has existed from the earliest of times. There was a lot of historical mythologizing, and blind people were seen as victims or people who committed sins, whether it was Oedipus or Tiresias. On the other side of the Oedipus thing, they were considered either victims or seers, and neither is true. So I believe that, and we have had great progress in developing technology for blind people. But in the end, they're not employed.
Yeah.
And so I think what I have tried to do is make as many people in our society aware of this particular problem, because, you know, it's the oldest cruelty. It's a subversion of the Creator's intent, and simply stated a damn injustice to humankind.
Yeah.
And so when we end blindness, and I believe we will, then all God's children will be able to not only feel sun shining on their faces, but witness with their own eyes its rising and its setting. And then I believe creation will be made whole.
We thank you, sir. Thank you so much for that. We almost have to go to the Q&A from the, but I just wanted to do a last question. In one of the last chapters of your book, you have an imaginary party, which is a lot of fun. There's thinkers, contemporary and classical thinkers, politicians, literary figures, fictional characters, outstanding people from the past and present, your closest friends and family, sports people, scientists, artists, actors, criminals, and musicians. A lot of musicians. Yep. You say in your book that making music is like a prescription for a disease that cannot be cured, but whose symptoms can be alleviated.
Yes.
Can you talk to us about your favorite albums, or and also your favorite Garfunkel song or album?
Well, obviously, The Sound of Silence, because of its title, Hello, Darkness. Yeah. But just as powerful to me is Bridge Over Troubled Water. Mm. I can't think of a song that is more pertinent to the story Arthur and I went through. And for a long time, it was personal before it was released. In fact, the day Arthur and Paul finished recording Bridge Over Troubled Water, he flew to Washington, and my 3-year-old, 4-year-old was playing it over and over again till he wore out the test pressing. But that was, at that moment, just between the two of us. But when you listen to the lyrics, you'll see that he really was my bridge over troubled water.
There's a question here that asks that, is it possible that Paul Simon wrote The Sound of Silence based on Arthur telling him about him reading you as darkness? Is there any chance that Paul Simon wrote The Sound of Silence based on Mr. Garfunkel telling him about him reading you as darkness? Do you think if there's any connection? Are you aware of it?
I am not aware of it.
Right. So I'm gonna thank you, sir. I'm gonna pass to the Q&A from the audience. There's how should educational, and there's no names on these questions. I'm sorry, they're all anonymous attendees. How should educational institutions such as Columbia and Harvard do or could do beyond what they are doing now to be inclusive to the visually impaired students and faculty?
Well, I think in the first instance, it's to strip away all of this historical mythologizing and see blind people as people who happen to be visually impaired and let them stand on their own record. And if they can succeed, then they should be part of the education that Harvard and Columbia can provide.
Thank you. Another question. Do you have any advice for the visually abled people around you? How to understand and recognize the blindness and the people affected by it?
I'm sorry, I don't quite understand the...
Yeah, what advice do you give to visually abled people around you to recognize, or like, maybe there's something that you say in your book that you reject the idea of someone be treated as a blind person, right?
Yes.
So in that sense, what advice would you give to the visually abled people around you to just get over that notion, I guess?
Simply stated, talk to them. Talk to them
Right.
about any subject you want, including blindness. Put it right out on the table.
Right.
It's a fact. And so it's easy to say, just deal with it, but I know that's not so simple.
Right.
But I think for, as you call a visually abled person, which is a first for me, I would say my grandmother taught me that one of the most important things, attributes one should have is compassion. And I think that blind people have a very, very big challenge in traversing this planet and educating themselves. So if you could find out what you could do to help them, as in the case of the many, many readers I had at Harvard, Oxford, and Columbia, that would be wonderful. Ask them if you could read to them, for example.
Thank you, sir. Another question is what did Art Garfunkel see in you that made him want to make the pact? And I think you went over those five things that he says, I think, in that list.
Yes. You want the 5? Is that what they're asking?
That's what the anonymous attendee is asking.
They're in the book, and it's a little embarrassing to.
Well, yeah, but I can more or less remember, sir. It's like this was your candor, your goodwill, your intelligence, your sympathy towards the small things, the big intelligence. I mean, it was a beautiful list that he could see from the early point the great value that you had, not only as a friend but as a human being. And I think, let me know if I got it incorrectly, but I think that was more or less
Absolutely, and that has lasted 60 years and going. So it was sincere. I can't think of a time other than the subway odyssey that Arthur and I have disagreed on anything significant.
right.
We both approach life from this perspective of, well, let's say it straight, awe. This life we have is quite something.
Yeah.
You know, I'm reminded of Albert Einstein's quote. If you have a minute, I'd like to share it with you.
Of course, sir.
The most beautiful experience we can have is the mysterious. It's the fundamental emotion which stands at the cradle of true art and science. Whoever does not know it can no longer wonder, can no longer marvel, is as good as dead, and his eyes are dim. To me, if you can't wonder or marvel at what you see and experience around the world, you'll miss the magic of daily living, the magnificent gargantuan essence, the beauty and the joy that can be uncovered within all things that you encounter on a daily basis. If you're walking with someone you love on vacation, or you do as I do sometimes, stand on the banks of the Potomac River, waiting for something extraordinary to happen. And it always does.
I love that notion, sir. There is a question from David Palmer that says, thank you for telling your very moving story. I'm interested to know whether your mode of thinking has changed in the years since you became blind. Do you still visualize things, or do you have other ways of organizing thinking?
No, it's very insightful. I visualize things very well. I'll give you an example. In my fine arts class, my sophomore year, I was so passionate about art. I visited every museum I could after class. And I recall one day standing at MoMA in front of Guernica. This was 59, and was stunned. I must have stood there and taken it in over 2 or 3 hours. And it made a massive impact on me, so that in the early 80s, when Sue and I took our children on a vacation, we went to the Prado and saw Guernica again in Spain. And standing in front of it brought back very wonderful and horrible feelings, because in truth, as I look back on it, that painting presaged my future a couple of years later.
Right. And I understand you have quite an art collection, so can you talk to us about your relationship with art?
With art?
Yeah.
Well, I'm an art enthusiast.
Right.
Let's put it that way. I don't want to. I was blessed with a friend named Frank Stella, who a couple of friends and I asked him if he would put my original compressed speech machine, which is a machine I had invented as a young man, and into a piece of sculpture.
Yeah.
And at first he said, I can't do it. But then after 2 years, he did it. He invited Sue and me down to his studio. And it was stunning and still resides in my home. And about a year or so ago, I went back to Frank and I asked him, see, to me, the End Blindness campaign, the reason those two words are important to me, and I believe to many people throughout the world, it's very clear. End blindness. Throughout our history, we have had signposts along the way so that we don't wander helter-skelter on the path of civilization.
Yeah.
And I asked him if he would create a sculpture that would symbolize the two words end blindness. There's go to the moon and polio and blindness. And I think to my right here is the sculpture that he and he introduced it at the award ceremony last December. But I have a lot of art that I like. I spent years hoping to purchase a Rembrandt, which I was able to do, which stemmed back to the time I saw his self-portrait in the Frick Gallery in '59.
Yeah.
I own a Rauschenberg and an Estes, and a number of other paintings that I don't want to,
of course,
bother you with.
I appreciate it, sir. I have another question from another attendee. The COVID virus has had a profound impact on all communities. What silver linings can be drawn as a result of COVID for communities of individuals who are blind and those who advocate for improvements?
What can be learned to benefit us? Is that the question?
What silver linings can be drawn as a result of COVID communities?
I think the biggest silver lining I see is that if you weren't caught up with COVID, the country came to a pause, and it gave people much needed opportunity, I think, to think, to reflect upon their lives, upon their future, and what they can do to help humanity go forward.
This is a question that talks again about that test that we spoke about with Mr. Garfunkel in the subway. and I think this is in everyone's mind. Did Arthur take into account the fact that you could have died that day of the test? Or was it his plan to save you from danger, if it came to that?
Well, that's precisely my wife's argument, that I could have gotten killed easily. which is a true statement, but that was the point.
Yeah.
How do you learn to become independent if you are not practicing independence? I would say it was it was harsh, but fortunately I can look back at it with great pleasure since it turned out well for me.
Yeah. Once there's another question that asks, once you made it home the day of that test, what is the hardest thing that you've had to do?
What is the hardest thing I had to do?
Yeah, you've had to do since, I guess. I think that person's asking about the challenges, like that seems like a very difficult moment to have to gone through.
Yeah.
And that person, I think, wants to know what other challenges you've had to face in that sense. I remember you talking a lot about an important number of scrapes and wounds, and having a doctor almost on call to tend to those. Can you talk to us a little bit about that?
Well, you stated it very well. I, most of the time, get hit in my forehead by, it seems that walls have a way of moving around my house and appear at very inconvenient times. So fortunately, I have a wonderful plastic surgeon who's a very good friend and stitches me up whenever I need to be stitched up.
Right. So far, the last question about the episode. You mentioned that what you said to God when you were lying on the tracks that day Arthur tested you. Can you tell us about your spiritual beliefs during the past decades and today?
My experience with
your spiritual beliefs.
I see. My spiritual beliefs, that's a, I would say this, that I like to think of myself as a man of faith, that faith was tested, and the way I put it is that Maimonides said, I believe with unwavering faith. And I have been unable to meet that standard. From time to time, I do waver. But on balance, I would say my whole life has been filled with a great spiritual relationship with the Almighty.
Thank you, sir. There's more questions and we're almost through. There's one candid question. How on earth were you able to graduate Phi Beta Kappa and as president of your class in your when you were blind? Were you superhuman and able to work harder, or you wrote very moving essays and gave very inspirational speeches?
No, I simply worked hard, really hard. That's why, for example, the Subway Odyssey vanquished fear in me. And the reason is that if you are so consumed by a mission, you don't have time to worry about fear. And when I came back to Columbia, I had no time to worry about whether this was the right or wrong thing. I'd made the decision, and I would do everything in my power to succeed. And I was very lucky. My classmates were wonderful to me, and my professors similarly. So I look back at those days with great fondness. I had a lot of help.
You also say something pretty remarkable in your book, that is, when you find out that you can memorize everything with ease. Can you talk to us briefly about this, sir?
I would say one can memorize things, but I'm not so sure it's with ease.
Right.
I think the way I do it is I understand the concept first, and then as I'm thinking about it, I'll be writing it in my head. I let it sit there for a while and then sit down and dictate it the next day.
Yeah. One other question says that it seems that one central core of your success is optimism, that even in your darkest hours, there was light and somehow clear for people around you that drove them to help to keep burning. Would you agree this was one of the main characteristics we'd need to instill among our visually impaired population?
Whether there's optimism.
Yeah, the value of optimism in life.
I think in my life, part of it, I guess, I can attribute to my blindness because of as Justice Ginsburg said, the ability to spend time inside my head without distractions means that for me, there's whatever I concoct in my head, and beyond that, there's the entire universe.
Right.
So optimism, look, it's so simple. If you can't believe that this gift of life is so damn precious every second of every day, even the bad things are good, because even the bad things are a source of remembrance, a flavor of this life. And our lives are very precious.
Yeah.
When they're gone, they're gone. So why not, given the fact that the Lord has provided us with ample opportunity to see the beauty in other people and in the environment.
Yeah. Someone is asking us to tell more about your remarkable career post-Columbia and a little bit more stories from the book. I mean, your achievements are enormous. You're the chairman of the board of governors of Johns Hopkins Wilmer Eye Institute. You're a fellow of the Academy of Arts and Sciences and a member of Council on Foreign Relations, among other things. Can you tell us some of the stories that, like, for example, talk to us a little bit about the Academy of Arts and Sciences. What does it mean to you to be a member, a fellow?
Well, first of all, I consider it to be a great honor. I did not apply for membership. I don't think you do.
Right.
And it's one of the oldest learned societies. And the people that I have met there are, to a person, extraordinary in a variety of fields. And since we are always searching for answers to questions about life, it's wonderful to talk to people in completely diverse areas of interest.
Right.
I find it exceedingly exciting.
Thank you, sir. Do you mean, there's another question here that says, do you mean to say that Bridge Over Troubled Waters was inspired by the relationship between Arthur and you?
I do not mean to say that at all. I don't know what inspired it. All I know that its words are very relevant to the relationship Arthur and I had and have.
Another question. Is the faith in the beauty of the world something your parents raised you with, or something you acquired yourself? The faith in the beauty of the world.
No, my mother and my father's and my grandmother were too busy surviving, let alone to teach me about the beauty or joy that's in the world. I spent much time alone as a young boy. And those were the days when I began dreaming. And that dreaming continued throughout my life. And the art that I loved, the nature that I loved, all came to a head because it was inchoate for me. But when Arthur pointed out that patch of grass, all of my thoughts coalesced into this magical moment where you said, my God, how beautiful that is. And how could I have missed it? I don't miss it anymore. I catch everything that I can.
Right. There's a question here that we more or less spoke of. Can you please describe the work of the End Blindness initiative that you lead? And something that I thought was interesting was that you say that you could have made a call to end glaucoma or retinitis pigmentosa, but instead you aim to end it all. Can you talk to us a little bit about this?
Well, I think that if I had said end glaucoma or end retinitis pigmentosa, that wouldn't go very far. It goes back to this notion of signposts that have occurred for humanity throughout history. And end blindness seemed to be a sizable enough idea and concept that people would take it seriously, as I think they should. I believe it goes beyond just blindness. If we can regenerate retinal nerve tissue, for example, what's to prevent us from regenerating the damaged neural tissue of quadriplegic and paraplegic accident victims? Right. Or repairing the diseased neural pathways of those who suffer from Parkinson's, multiple sclerosis, perhaps even Alzheimer's. So blindness, they say the eyes are windows to the soul. Well, I think blindness is an opening for us to deal with the core of our humanity, to wit, the central nervous system. Mm. And that is part of what we are going to be exploring as we move forward.
We were talking about this technology that is very connecting directly to the visual cortex.
Yes.
Bypassing the optic nerve.
Yes.
And doing implants that could interpret light directly into the brain.
Absolutely. There was, I was fortunate enough to play a small part in that. The gentleman who developed that idea as a man named Mark Humayun. And in the late 90s, I was approached by his mentor and asked if I thought the idea of a retinal chip was a good one. So I am a non-scientist, let me be clear.
Yeah.
But I like big ideas. And the idea of putting a retinal chip into one's eye to enable a person to see captured my imagination. And so he asked if I could help him get funding. I had been appointed by President Clinton to serve on the National Science Board, which oversees the National Science Foundation. So I sat down with my colleagues and I asked them if they would support this retinal chip, and I gave them all the appropriate papers. And they came back and they said no. And they asked me, Mark asked me if I would go back a second time. So I went back a second time and they said no. On my own, I went back a third time and they said yes. And many millions of dollars came from the National Science Foundation to support the technology you're talking about right now.
Right. And Argus 2 was FDA approved probably 5 or 6 years ago, and
Yes,
it's
sir.
now affords approximate vision to people with retinitis pigmentosa. Were you surprised by your level of success, or not surprised at all? This is another question.
I'm sorry, what's the question?
Were you surprised by your level of success, or not surprised at all?
I never looked at it that way. My
Right.
I subscribe, as I mentioned before, to my grandmother's admonitions, one of which is have compassion, be charitable, educate yourself, and as she put it, be a mensch. And I don't know if you're familiar with that word, but it's a very meaningful one in our faith. And it refers to a person of great integrity, probity, decency, nobility. And so all I've done is try and strive to meet those standards.
Right, sir. Thank you. Another question is, do you feel that your blindness made you a more perceptive person? Were your other 5 senses heightened in some way?
I think that is the common view. I suppose that one could say it forced me to use my memory to substitute for my vision. And in that regard, I would say that that's correct. But as to the other, no, I don't see it. Taste, touch, smell. No, memory is the only thing I would say it enhanced.
Right. And this is going to be your last question. Do you see yourself as a regular person who is blind, or do you see yourself as someone who has the blessing of physical blindness, which enables you to be more insightful than people with sight?
I'm a guy named Sandy Greenberg, born and raised in Buffalo, New York, and have lived one of the greatest lives in my imagination. And that's due to this incredible country we live in. Because here in the United States, I've walked in freedom, whereas many members of my family perished in circumstances that were quite the opposite of free. And so for me, there's been an unwritten, unspoken mandate to contribute, to do something in public service that would help the common good. That's who I am.
And as we've seen, your imagination is quite fertile, sir. Thank you so much for that. Would you want to give any final remarks, sir?
Well, we are soon going to make an announcement about our next steps in the End Blindness campaign. And if any person who is viewing this program is interested, please check in with www.endblindness2020.com. The announcement won't come out till the fall, but I'd welcome your participation. And as important, I want to thank you and Canvas for your incredible grace and gentleness in making this interview happen. Thank you.
Thank you, sir, for the book and for your life and for all of your achievements. I just want to say that this recording shared with everyone in 24 hours. And I also want to thank Canvas and Paul Greenberg and everyone at the Columbia Alumni Association of Washington, D.C. and the Harvard Club of Washington, who's a co-sponsor of this event. And again, sir, thank you for being here and congratulations on this remarkable life and on your book. I took it on vacation and my wife was a little bit jealous. I was spending too much time with it. So she might want to have a word with you afterwards.
Please extend my apologies to her.
No apologies needed. Thank you so much, sir. Thank
Take
you
care.
again. And thanks everyone for watching us.
Thank you, sir.
Have a good evening.
You too.